What was life really like in the Middle Ages? 7 things that might surprise you. When people hear the words Middle Ages, many imagine dirty streets, knights in armor, castles, the plague, and people who never washed. But the reality was a little more interesting than that. The Middle Ages were not just a dark period full of poverty. It was a world where people worked from morning until night, feared disease, lived according to the seasons, but also knew how to have fun, trade, travel, and create things we still admire today. Let's look at 7 things about life in the Middle Ages that might surprise you. 1. People were not always dirty. A very common myth says that people in the Middle Ages never washed at all. That is not completely true. In towns, public bathhouses existed, where people went not only for hygiene, but also to relax and meet others. Of course, hygiene was not like it is today. There were no showers, modern bathrooms, or disinfectants. But the idea that everyone walked around unwashed for years is exaggerated. People washed their hands, faces, and, when possible, their whole bodies. The bigger problem was that towns did not have good sewage systems. Waste often ended up in the streets, and clean water was not always guaranteed. So the Middle Ages did not smell like a modern bathroom, but it also was not a world where nobody ever washed. 2. Food was not just dry bread. When we imagine food in the Middle Ages, we might think of hard bread and a bowl of some kind of porridge. And yes, bread and porridge were very common, but the diet was more varied than it may seem. Ordinary people ate grain porridge, bread, vegetables, legumes, cheese, eggs, fish, and sometimes meat. Meat, however, was not on the table every day, especially for poorer people. More often, people ate things they could grow or find nearby. Beer was also very important, not always because everyone wanted to drink alcohol, but because water could be contaminated. Weak beer was a normal part of daily life in some areas. The nobility, of course, had a completely different diet. At feasts, they served meat, spices, cakes, wine, and dishes meant to show wealth. 3. Children worked from a very young age. Today, we associate childhood with school, games, and free time. In the Middle Ages, things were different. Children learned to help at home from an early age. In villages, they helped with animals, worked in the fields, carried water, or collected firewood. In towns, they could learn a trade, help in a workshop, or become apprentices. That does not mean children never played. They did play, ran around outside, and had their own children's games. But life was harder, and work was a natural part of every day. Many children had to grow up quickly because the family needed every pair of hands. 4. Life was ruled by the seasons. In the Middle Ages, there were no supermarkets, electric heating, or modern supply systems. People depended much more on nature. Spring meant sowing seeds and preparing the soil. Summer was a time of hard work in the fields. Autumn was the season for harvesting and preparing for winter. And winter was the most difficult because there was little fresh food, the days were short, and the cold could be dangerous. If the harvest failed, it could mean hunger. One bad season could change the life of an entire village. For us, winter is often a time of holidays and warmth at home. For people in the Middle Ages, it was a season that simply had to be survived. 5. Disease was a huge problem. One of the greatest threats of the Middle Ages was disease. Today we have antibiotics, hospitals, vaccinations, and doctors with modern equipment. In the Middle Ages, even things that we can treat fairly easily today could be dangerous. An infection, an injury, a fever, or childbirth could end in death. The most famous catastrophe was the plague, which struck Europe in the 14th century and killed an enormous number of people. Towns emptied, families fell apart, and people often did not understand why the disease had come. Medicine was a mixture of experience, herbs, religious beliefs, and sometimes completely wrong methods. Doctors did exist, but their options were very limited. 6. Not everyone lived in a castle. Castles are one of the main symbols of the Middle Ages today. But most people never lived in a castle. Ordinary people lived mostly in villages. Their houses were simple, often made of wood, clay, straw, or stone, depending on what was available nearby. A house could have 1 or 2 rooms, and people and animals often lived very close together. A castle was the home of the nobility, a defensive place, and a symbol of power. For ordinary people, it was more often something they saw from a distance, or a place where they could take shelter in times of danger. Everyday medieval life, therefore, did not happen mainly in castle halls, but in fields, workshops, by the oven, in stables, and at the market. 7. Entertainment existed. Sometimes we imagine life in the Middle Ages as nothing but work, hunger, and fear. But people also knew how to enjoy themselves. They had holidays, markets, music, dancing, storytellers, games, contests, feasts, and religious celebrations. A market was not only a place to buy things, it was also a place where people met, heard news, and saw things they did not usually encounter. For many people, holidays were very important because they interrupted everyday work. Music, food, and company were ways to rest from hard life, at least for a while. Even in difficult times, people needed joy, stories, and laughter. The Middle Ages were not just a world of castles, knights, and kings. For most people, life was simple, difficult, and often dangerous, but it was also full of work, faith, family, traditions, and moments of joy. It was a world very different from ours, and maybe that is exactly why it still fascinates us today. Thank you for watching.